Section 517.73 allows the installation of a disconnect switch adjacent to the equipment itself and limits the use of disconnect switches to equipment that is not intended to be often operated by the operator. Section 660.6 requires that disconnect switches be within sight from and readily accessible from the equipment they serve, but does not limit the use of disconnect switches to equipment that is not often operated. A conflict arises because Section 517.73 allows disconnect switches to be installed adjacent to the equipment, while Section 660.6 requires them to be within sight from and readily accessible from the equipment. In cases of conflicts between articles in the National Electrical Code, the more specific article takes precedence. Therefore, Section 660.6 takes precedence over Section 517.73 in this case. Disconnect switches must be installed within sight from and readily accessible from the equipment they serve, as required by Section 660.6. It's understandable that Section 517.73 appears more lenient, but the requirements of Section 660.6 should be followed for the installation of disconnect switches where it applies. To further clarify the application of these sections, consider the scope and intent of each. Section 517.73 falls under Article 517, which specifically addresses healthcare facilities. This article provides supplemental requirements for electrical installations in these facilities, recognizing the unique needs and potential hazards associated with patient care. Section 660.6, on the other hand, is part of Article 660, which covers X-ray equipment. This article outlines specific requirements for the electrical supply and control of X-ray equipment, including disconnect switches. The conflict arises because some equipment covered under Article 660, such as X-ray machines, may also be located within a healthcare facility. In such cases, both Article 517 and Article 660 could potentially apply. However, because Article 660 is more specific to the equipment in question, its requirements take precedence. The rationale behind the within-sight requirement of Section 660.6 is to ensure that the operator of the X-ray equipment has immediate control over the power supply in case of an emergency. If the disconnect switch is not within sight and readily accessible, the operator may not be able to quickly shut down the equipment if a hazardous situation arises. This is particularly important in medical settings where patient safety is paramount. Furthermore, the term readily accessible is defined in Article 100 of the National Electrical Code as being capable of being reached quickly for operation without requiring those to whom ready access is requisite to climb over or remove obstacles or to resort to portable ladders, and so forth. This means that the disconnect switch must be easily reachable and operable without any special tools or procedures. To ensure compliance with Section 660.6, consider the following factors when installing a disconnect switch for X-ray equipment. Firstly, the disconnect switch must be located within direct line of sight of the X-ray equipment. Secondly, the disconnect switch must be readily accessible, meaning it can be easily reached and operated without any obstructions. Thirdly, the disconnect switch must be clearly labeled to identify the equipment it serves. Fourthly, the disconnect switch must be installed in accordance with all other applicable requirements of the National Electrical Code, including those related to wiring methods, overcurrent protection, and grounding. In addition to these specific requirements, it's also important to consider the general safety principles of electrical installations. Always ensure that all electrical work is performed by qualified personnel who are familiar with the National Electrical Code and other applicable standards. Use appropriate personal protective equipment, such as gloves and safety glasses, when working with electrical equipment. To energize circuits before working on them whenever possible, and always verify that circuits are de-energized before touching any conductors or components. Following these guidelines will help ensure safe and compliant electrical installations in healthcare facilities and other settings where X-ray equipment is used. When interpreting conflicting code requirements, it is essential to consider the overall intent and purpose of the National Electrical Code, which is to provide for the safety of persons and property from hazards arising from the use of electricity. The code is not intended to be a design specification, nor is it intended to provide all the answers to every possible electrical installation scenario. Rather, it provides a set of minimum requirements that must be met to ensure a safe and reliable electrical system. In cases where the code is unclear or ambiguous, it is important to consult with a qualified electrical engineer or inspector to obtain clarification. These professionals have the knowledge and experience to interpret the code correctly and to apply it to specific situations. Furthermore, it is important to stay up to date with the latest edition of the National Electrical Code, as the code is revised and updated every 3 years to reflect changes in technology and industry best practices. Failing to comply with the latest code requirements can result in fines, penalties, and potentially dangerous electrical installations. In summary, when faced with a conflict between Section 517.73 and Section 660.6 of the National Electrical Code, Section 660.6 takes precedence because it is the more specific requirement for disconnect switches serving X-ray equipment. Disconnect switches must be installed within sight from and readily accessible from the equipment they serve, as required by Section 660.6. By following these requirements and consulting with qualified professionals when necessary, it is possible to ensure safe and compliant electrical installations in healthcare facilities and other settings where X-ray equipment is used. Consider a specific example to illustrate this point. Imagine an X-ray machine installed in a hospital radiology department. Section 517.73 might allow the disconnect switch to be placed in an adjacent room, perhaps in a control room or electrical closet. However, Section 660.6 mandates that the disconnect switch be within sight of the X-ray machine. This means the switch must be located in the same room as the X-ray machine, allowing the operator to quickly shut off power in an emergency. Let's say a technician is performing maintenance on the X-ray machine and a malfunction occurs, causing a potential hazard. If the disconnect switch is in another room, the technician would have to leave the machine, potentially exposing themselves or others to danger, to shut off the power. With the disconnect switch within sight, the technician can immediately cut power to the machine, mitigating the risk. This example highlights the importance of the within sight requirement in Section 660.6. It prioritizes immediate control and safety in potentially hazardous situations. While Section 517.73 offers more flexibility in general disconnect switch placement within healthcare facilities, it cannot override the specific safety requirements for X-ray equipment outlined in Section 660.6. Remember, the National Electrical Code is designed to be a minimum safety standard. Always prioritize safety and consult with qualified professionals to ensure compliance and prevent potential hazards. Another important aspect to consider is the proper labeling of the disconnect switch. Section 110.22 of the National Electrical Code requires that all disconnect switches be legibly marked to indicate their purpose. This is crucial for identifying the correct switch in an emergency situation. The label should clearly state the equipment that the switch controls, such as X-ray machine #1 or radiology department X-ray unit. The labeling should be durable and resistant to environmental factors such as moisture and chemicals. It's also a good practice to use a standardized labeling system throughout the facility to avoid confusion. In addition to the location and labeling of the disconnect switch, it's also important to ensure that the switch is properly maintained. Regularly inspect the switch for signs of damage or wear, such as cracked insulation, loose connections, or corroded contacts. Test the switch periodically to verify that it is functioning correctly. If any problems are found, repair or replace the switch immediately. Proper maintenance will help ensure that the disconnect switch is always ready to operate when needed. Furthermore, consider the implications of the Americans with Disabilities Act (ADA) when locating the disconnect switch. The ADA requires that all electrical equipment be accessible to persons with disabilities. This means that the disconnect switch must be mounted at a height that is reachable by individuals in wheelchairs and that the area around the switch must be free of obstructions. The ADA also requires that the switch be operable with one hand and without tight grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist. Adhering to these requirements will help ensure that the disconnect switch is accessible to all individuals, regardless of their physical abilities. In addition to the National Electrical Code and the ADA, there may be other applicable codes and standards that must be followed. For example, some states and local jurisdictions have their own electrical codes that are more stringent than the National Electrical Code. It's important to be aware of these local requirements and to ensure that all electrical installations comply with them. Furthermore, certain healthcare facilities may be subject to accreditation by organizations such as the Joint Commission. These organizations have their own standards for electrical safety that must be met in order to maintain accreditation. It is necessary to consult with these organizations to determine the specific requirements that apply to a particular facility. Continuing education is also crucial for staying up to date with the latest changes in the National Electrical Code and other applicable standards. Attend seminars, workshops, and conferences to learn about new technologies and best practices in electrical safety. Read trade journals and publications to stay informed about current issues and trends in the electrical industry. By staying informed and continuously improving your knowledge and skills, you can help ensure that all electrical installations are safe, compliant, and reliable. In conclusion, while Section 517.73 of the National Electrical Code may offer more lenient requirements for the placement of disconnect switches in healthcare facilities, Section 660.6 takes precedence when dealing with X-ray equipment. This section mandates that disconnect switches be installed within sight from and readily accessible from the equipment they serve. This requirement is crucial for ensuring immediate control and safety in potentially hazardous situations. By understanding the specific requirements of Section 660.6, properly locating and labeling disconnect switches, and maintaining them in good working order, it is possible to create a safe and compliant electrical system for X-ray equipment in healthcare facilities and other settings. Remember to consult with qualified professionals and stay up to date with the latest codes and standards to ensure the highest level of electrical safety.